This is the podcast of the Nova Center on Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. Welcome.
Welcome to the podcast of the Nova Center on the Business, Human Rights, and the Environment. My name is Luís Prata, Castro, and I will be the research associate conducting today's podcast interview. So today we'll be speaking about businesses and affected communities, taking a human rights-based approach to meaningful engagement for addressing impacts effectively. As companies operate in increasingly complex environments, engaging meaningfully with affected communities is no longer optional, it's essential. New legal frameworks like the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, notably through its ESRS S3 standard, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, now require companies to identify affected communities, assess actual and potential impacts, especially on vulnerable and marginalized groups, and to take appropriate measures to prevent, mitigate, and remedy harm in line with applicable human rights standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines. This marks a fundamental shift from voluntary engagement to structured, accountable human rights due diligence. In today's episode, we will not only be discussing the launch of a new practical guide on meaningful engagement with affected communities, published under the auspices of the UN Global Compact France, but also sharing critical insights on how Indigenous peoples in particular view engagement, impact, and business responsibility, and why their perspectives must shape corporate practices moving forward. Today, we're joined by two expert voices. Céline de Graca Pires is a business and human rights advisor and a qualified French lawyer with over a decade of field experience working directly with affected communities, including Indigenous and tribal peoples. She has led human rights impact assessments and community engagement processes across various regions of the world, including in very high-risk contexts and fragile environments. Céline led a dedicated task force at the UN Global Compact France, composed of multinational companies across sectors, to develop the first French practical guide on meaningful engagement with affected communities, which she authored and which was published on March 25th under the auspices of the UN Global Compact France. Alancay Morales Garro is a Borjka Indigenous person from Costa Rica and is the lead for business and human rights at Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, IPRI. Thank you so much for being here, Céline and Alancay. We will now be moving to our first question, directed to Céline. What made the guide necessary, considering the challenges you've seen in how companies engage with affected communities and how communities experience that engagement? Thank you.
Thanks, Luís, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here today in great company with you and Alancay. So to answer your question, the guide was developed in response to needs expressed by companies during the dedicated task force you mentioned that we launched in the UN Global Compact France back in May 2023. And during the task force discussions, it became clear that many companies are still in the early stages of developing a structured approach to engaging with affected communities. In most cases, community engagement remains reactive, minimal, and compliance-driven, rather than being seen as a core part of a human rights due diligence process and a long-term business relationships. So many companies across sector needed support to better define who are affected communities, practical tools, methodologies to build meaningful engagement in line with international human rights standards. And on the ground, we often see two disconnected words. Companies on one side, communities on the other side. That's why the guide's title includes a hyphen, business affected communities, because this is deliberate. The hyphen is a breach. It reflects the very purpose of the guide to reconnect basically these two words. And why now? Why is now necessary? So 3 contextual shifts I would like to mention. First, from the French duty of vigilance law applicable in France to new EU frameworks like the CSRD you mentioned or the CSDDD, companies, especially large multinationals, now operate under a much more demanding legal environment. And for the first time under ESRS 3 of the CSRD, they are explicitly required to disclose and communicate how their operation impact affected communities and how they engage with them. This marks a shift from broad commitments to concrete reportable obligation, moving basically from policy to practice and accountability. Then the second contextual aspect of the necessity is affected stakeholders, especially indigenous and tribal people. Alancay will speak about that. They are now supported by international NGOs and becoming more organized, increasingly seeking to hold companies accountable for adverse impact on their rights, land, environment. And in recent years, talking about France, we have seen a growing number of legal actions filed under the French duty of vigilance law, and some of them link directly to inadequate engagement with affected communities or lack of engagement and violation of free, prior and informed consent.
The third contextual aspect we'd like to mention is that in today's environmental, social and economic crisis that jointly we mention as polycrisis, we see an intensification of tensions in many territories between companies and affected communities, especially in areas where trust is already weak or where past harms remain unresolved. And these dynamics are making operating environments increasingly fragile for companies, requiring companies to move beyond compliance-driven approaches and invest in long-term and trust-based relationships with affected communities. So that for the three contextual aspects. And based on those contextual aspects in the guide, we identify three essential paradigm shifts needed in the way companies engage with affected communities. The first paradigm shift is that we would like companies to consider shifting from risk management approach to trust-building relationship with affected communities. Because too often on the ground, what we see is that the starting point is a flawed assumption that communities represent a threat or a risk to be managed, and this defensive posture leads to minimal reactive engagement only when legally required or in times of crisis. And that fuels mistrust and reinforces distance. So we want with this first paradigm shift, companies to consider building long-term trust, which is requires, and shifting this mindset and recognizing communities as key long-term partners.
And also the second paradigm shift we look for in this guide is from legal compliance to social true legitimacy, meaning it's not because the company has the right permits, as the administrative or legal approvals, that it guarantees the acceptance of the project by affected communities and indigenous people. It's not because a project is perfectly legal that is legitimate in the eyes of affected communities. And finally, we want to move from short-term transaction to long-term relationship. We hear on the ground some companies saying communities are looking for immediate benefits, money, but this assumption, incorrect assumption, is exactly leading to this transactional dynamic of relationship. So we want this shift in the mindset to look at communities, affected communities, as partners in the long term and being seen as key partners, I will say, to be respected.
Thank you, Céline, for your answer. We will now follow to Alancay. What challenges have you observed in your practice within the IPRE in the relation between companies and indigenous peoples? Thank you.
Thank you, Luís, and thank you, Céline, for today's opportunity to share with you on the podcast. And on this issue, I would like to emphasize two parts. The first one relates to the history, that the relationship between business and indigenous peoples has been historically tainted with human rights violations of all sorts: displacement, the loss of livelihoods, criminalization, violence, killings of defenders, among others. So in that context is that indigenous peoples, the way that they address relationships with business, we have to keep that in context to understand certain dynamics that happen. And these situations of this relationship between indigenous peoples and business is indistinctive of region. We have these cases in the global north, but also in the global south. But things have changed on various levels. On one end, more and more are indigenous peoples participating in business-related activities, be it their own businesses, as well as in partnerships, oftentimes between indigenous peoples and third parties, businesses that might be from outside of a community. So there has been a broader development in that understanding between each other. Nevertheless, various challenges remain, and I think Céline pointed to a couple of these. In some locations, a fundamental issue is related to the rights recognition by state, and thereby the respect that companies have of indigenous peoples in those states. So we have some countries in Africa, some in Asia, where indigenous peoples do not exist in the legal framework. So there is no applicable framework in the domestic context that respects and provides specific provisions for indigenous peoples. And the other part relates to trust that Céline covered in a very good way. And just to mention that the trust, I think, we're seeing more and more how there are good practices in terms of building trust between indigenous peoples and businesses. For example, in IPRI, in conjunction with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we documented a series of cases where there has been co-ownership between indigenous peoples and non-indigenous businesses in the context of the just transition. And the key element has been the development of trust. But trust is something that is built and it cannot be forced. So that's a challenge in terms of the timelines that sometimes companies have, that they want to pursue projects in a specific timeline, and they are forcing indigenous peoples into decision-making that doesn't really respect their decision-making processes and the time they need to digest and process everything. So that's a key issue that we need to build on. The other one relates to transparency. At IPRI, we often receive cases that relate to a mining operation, for example, that it's very difficult to identify who the owners of this mining operation are, whether there is any extraterritorial responsibility, either if it's owned by a business in somewhere else, or if it's a domestic business, or sometimes even the transactions that are done, that an operation is sold from one company to the other, and there is little to no knowledge as to who are the responsible parties behind that, much less issues around the value chain and others around these operations. Another one that has been very well documented and that we still find a lot in the cases that we are looking into relates to the power imbalances. Oftentimes the projects that are being proposed or developed on indigenous peoples' lands, they may have the approval from the state. So we have basically a business in conjunction with the state pushing forward for an initiative, for a project. And that leads to the community of being in a very disadvantageous position. The same thing happens with the resources available. Recently, in a conversation with a leader from my country, they were mentioning, what we being a defender in my community has meant that I have to renounce to the different things that make us indigenous, being able to care for the land, being able to share with the younger generations, among other things, because they have to be from one meeting to the other, attending all sorts of teams of people that are interested in things within their territory. So those imbalances of having resources and indigenous peoples having very little and basically being allocating their time, efforts, putting their lives at risk is one of those imbalances that we see. And lastly is that we are seeing also that in the context of a lot of these operations, when there are rights violations, access to remedy remains a very, very big challenge. And this relates to the operations, but also things that may happen in connection with that operation. For example, if people are being criminalized, if there is a killing of a defender, whether indigenous peoples are being able to access remedy for those cases. So that basically covers like the main issues that we're finding, but of course there are others that we can see on a country by country basis or a case specific basis. Back to you, Luis.
Thank you so much. Now moving forward, Céline, after identifying the need for a paradigm shift, which we just explained in more detail, the guide begins with a clarification of key concepts: affected communities, impacts, meaningful engagement. Could you tell us more about each of these, particularly what is meant by affected communities? Thank you.
Thanks, Luis, and thanks, Alancay, for this great introduction on the relationship, taking into account historical background between the companies and indigenous people. So I think it's exactly that. I think when we started the guide, two things happened. First one, we realized how important was to actually remind the historic component of relationship and the past traumas. That was the first one. And secondly, we start by saying how important are words and using the right words in this context. So when we engage with companies through the task force meetings, we realized how much confusion still exists around terms like affected communities or meaningful engagement. And I do think that words are important. I'm convinced that when we get the words right, we are much more likely to get the attitudes and behaviors right on the ground. Basically, clarity in language shapes clarity in action. So the first task we had was to clarify key concepts. Affected communities first. We started with the definition provided by ESRSS 3, which is the third of the four social standards under the CSRD. And to quote ESRSS 3 definition, affected communities are defined as people or groups living or working in the same area that have been or may be affected by company's operation or through its upstream and downstream value chain. And affected communities, again, according to ESRSS 3, can range from those living adjacent to the company's operation, local communities, to those living at a distance. And affected communities, again, under ESRSS 3, include actual and potential affected indigenous people. So we start with this definition. And you see that it's not just about proximity. It's not only about identifying communities who are physically close to a site or operation. And we made it really clear in the guide. It's about applying a human rights-based and risk-based approach to ask who is or could be exposed to risk of harm as a result of business activity, directly, indirectly. For example, affected communities might include villages located along transport routes, exposed to dust, noise, safety risk from trucks carrying raw materials to a port. They can also include groups or people impacted by the practices of suppliers, service providers operating on behalf of the company. They might also include communities living near waste disposal or recycling site at the downstream end of the value chain. And the second point I would like to raise is that crucially, we need to move away also from the idea that there is a single type of affected communities. Affected communities can be urban, rural, nomadic, sedentary, coastal, if we include fishing communities, transhumant, and of course indigenous and tribal people. And it's essential to recognize the diversity of affected community profiles, each shaped by unique territorial, cultural, social characteristic, and as Alancay mentioned, historical background and traumas. And the guide pushes companies to capture that diversity and better understand the unique reality of each community they may impact. So that's for affected communities. Then we unpack on the guide other key concepts for the topic. Impacts, for instance, the guide does recognize that businesses can bring positive impact, jobs, access to services in certain areas. But it's also clearly states that the first responsibility of any companies across sector is to do not harm. That's why the guide focuses first on adverse impact. We have included a list of the most frequently reported adverse impact developed jointly with communities we engage directly, including during fieldworks. And this list includes displacement from ancestral lands, pollution of water and soil, destruction of cultural heritage, social fragmentation, which is really important, and importantly, and as Alancay mentioned, intimidation, violence against community leaders, human rights, and environmental defenders, for instance. And this is not an exhaustive list. And most importantly, we also grounded the guide in our current world, and cumulative impact is a key focus in the world we are living. It's a key challenge today. It will be even more a challenge tomorrow. In a context of accelerating climate change consequences and increasing pressure on planetary boundaries, we really wanted to do a focus on cumulative impacts, which refers for the audience to the combined and successive effects of multiple projects, often from different companies across sectors operating in the same region and using the same and shared natural resources like water. And we see it in certain regions. If we think about Salt Flats area in some Latin American country, how multiple extractive operations combined with other company operation are placing growing stress on fragile water and biodiversity ecosystems. So cumulative impact is really key for companies to understand in order also to map effectively affected communities. And then the third is about meaningful community engagement under meaningful stakeholder engagement. And we really wanted to make clear that it's not about ticking boxes. It's really about rethinking the very nature of the relationship. And it's a process that goes far beyond punctual top-down consultation. It's about establishing an ongoing two-way dialogue where communities are not just informed, they are genuinely involved in shaping the decisions that affect lives, rights, and their territories, which means engaging early before key decisions are made, engaging continuously, not just once, adapting engagement methods to the local context, the diversity of voices, and the level of risk, because what we want companies to understand is really a pragmatic approach, risk-based approach aligned with UNGPs and OECD guidelines plus CSDDD requirements. We don't want companies to engage with every single community in the territory the same way. We want the depth of engagement to reflect the severity of the potential or actual harm. That's when the purpose of the guide is to help companies allocate the right resources effectively. So it's really pragmatic, risk-based, and proportionate approach to engagement aligned with international human rights standards.
Thank you so much, Céline. It's really to highlight that it's really important to put companies in the same page regarding those impacts and those concepts. So thank you so much. Now moving on to Alancay. As Céline mentioned, the ESRS S3 refers to Indigenous and tribal people. Who are they? What are the criteria for identifying them? What specific rights do they hold? And what particular considerations or characteristics should companies be especially aware when engaging with them?
Yes, Luís, you're touching on a core issue, and that's a starting point as to who Indigenous peoples are And just to make a reference on the, let's say, the nomenclature that we use, there are multiple terms that are used around the world depending on the countries. For example, in Canada, we have First Nations, in Guyana, Amerindians, in Australia, Aboriginal people, and then Indigenous peoples. And so there are multiple terms, that are used to refer to the same group of people, and that there is a legal framework that is applicable to Indigenous peoples. The common understanding that we have, and this was a consensus that was built by Indigenous peoples in the negotiations over 20 years at the UN for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was that the term would be Indigenous peoples, although sometimes some refer as Indigenous nations as well. So that is basically to state the point that from an Indigenous people's perspective, that's the term that we use in a lot of these frameworks and policies that we're working on. Now, it's like, who are Indigenous peoples? The question that you're raising. And there are a couple of open definitions that we have worked with. One that was, it's a seminal type of paper that was developed in the UN by a special rapporteur by the name of José Martínez Cobo. And the definition there, basically, that has been used in numerous documents and policies. It's not a prescriptive definition, but rather it gives us characteristics as to who Indigenous peoples, communities, or nations are. And that's basically those that have a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, that they consider themselves distinct from other sectors of society that are now prevailing in those territories, and they form at present non-dominant sectors of society, and there is a commitment to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations our territory, our identity, and our existence for the future generations. And this is done in accordance with our own institutions, cultural norms, and legal systems. There is along the years also, there are nuances to consider, because the Martínez-Cobo definition has a component that relates to pre-colonial and invasion, and the invasion of specific nations, it's a very clear cut in the case of the Americas, but not necessarily in other places. So a further framework that can help us better understand this was developed by Madame Daes, or Erika Irene Daes, back in the 80s. And there are 4 criteria that were given for this. One is the occupation and use of a specific territory, the decision by Indigenous peoples themselves to perpetuate our cultural distinctiveness, and this may include language, our forms of organization, spiritual values, among other things. And 3, the self-identification as Indigenous. And lastly, the experience of subjugation, marginalization, and dispossession, because the Martínez-Cobo definition is not applicable in countries, for example, like Nepal, where it was never colonized. So just making that nuanced understanding. The other point is that when we talk about Indigenous and tribal peoples, there are both subjective and objective criteria that we should consider. First, in the subjective criteria is the self-identification that I was mentioning. But the objective criteria has to do with the perpetuation of Indigenous peoples in that country over time, and that those peoples maintain forms of their social, economic, and cultural institutions. Tribal peoples, it's a similar thing, but let's say we have, for example, in the Americas, tribal peoples, such as the Saramacca people, which are, we can find both in Suriname and French Guyana. And basically, the subjective criteria is the self-identification, and the objective criteria relates to the cultural, social, and economic conditions that distinguish them from other sectors of society, and how they govern themselves by their own customs, traditions, and institutions, for example. So that's a key component as to what we speak about when we speak about indigenous peoples. Then a couple of other things to note that are very important. The first one is that there is the relationship between indigenous peoples and their lands and territories and resources are key for explaining who we are, and that relationship, the knowledge that has been developed, the cultural and spiritual value that these territories have. So when companies are engaging with indigenous peoples, it's important for them to understand that there are different views of the world and that the relationship with the territory is distinct from what it can be in the Western context. And that's a key element to highlight. And lastly, a question sometimes arises in the sense of what the rights are of indigenous peoples. And just to focus on two key elements. One is that the nature of the rights of indigenous peoples is that it's collective instead of individual. A lot of what we have in what were developed back in the 60s, 70s, in terms of human rights agreements were focused on individual rights, whereas indigenous peoples exercise these rights in a collective way. And so the frameworks that we have right now that develop specifically the rights of indigenous peoples have that element of collective rights, and that means that the right to self-determination as to basically us determining our own economic, social, and cultural development, as well as our participation in our political life, in the country. Those are decisions that are done collectively as indigenous peoples and not individually. I'll leave it there for the time being, and I think we can elaborate a bit more on a couple of other points in the next part. Back to you, Luís.
Thank you so much, Alancay. Moving forward, Céline. The guide outlines key steps for achieving meaningful community engagement. Could you walk us through these steps and explain how they help build trust and long-term respectful relationship with affected communities?
Thanks, Luís, and thanks, Alancay, for clarifying what we mean by indigenous and tribal peoples. Just to echo you on the guide, we actually refer to the subjective and objective criteria you mentioned, and we also made really clear that the collective rights of indigenous and tribal peoples need also to shape the way companies engage with indigenous and tribal people. And the collective approach is really crucial at the time of engagement, and the respect for their own representative structure, because it's a right, also collective right for indigenous people to actually identify and use their own representative structure to engage with companies. So there are specific considerations for companies to take into account when they engage with indigenous and tribal peoples. Back to your question, Luís, on key steps of the guide. Yes, the main objectives of the guide was to offer a clear step-by-step approach to support companies at all levels of maturity. As I mentioned before, many of them in this topic were at the very early stages. So we wanted a practical but also very pragmatic approach. So we came with 7 practical steps, along with 2 key operational challenges we often see on the ground. And the 7 steps and the structure of the guide, again, I want to emphasize that, was shaped through a multi-stakeholder process, including 50 interviews with community representatives, indigenous and tribal leaders, NGOs, business practitioners, experts. So the steps I will outline in a minute were really developed with those most concerned, both communities and companies, to actually create this practical and useful tool, we hope. So step 1 is who to engage. I mentioned that already, so in the interest of time, I will not deep dive into this too much, but it's to identify affected communities. And it may sound simple, but in practice is really often overlooked or misunderstood, and that creates blind spots. And when this step is rushed or poorly handled, it creates gaps that undermine the entire engagement process, which start in the wrong foot. One of the key questions and a key debate we really want to emphasize in the guide was about legitimate representation of affected communities. So once a company identifies who is affected in a given territory, for instance, the next critical step is understanding who can legitimately represent them. And this is crucial for meaningful engagement. And as we state in the guide, representativeness is not always legitimacy. Communities are rarely an homogeneous group, and a single leader, even if elected, even if traditional, may not speak for everyone in the community. That's why the guide recommends a pluralistic approach, engaging behind formal authorities and involving a diversity of voices, including those genuinely recognized by the community itself as representing their interests. And most importantly, legitimacy evolves. Legitimacy is not set in stones, is contextual, is dynamic, is shift over time. A person seen as legitimate today may no longer be tomorrow, in 1 year, in 2 years, as local dynamics shift. And company needs to stay attentive to that, because legitimacy can't be fixed once and assumed to last. So that's for the step one. Step two is about setting a governance framework for engagement. Basically, who engage on behalf of the company. And this is a key topic that we don't hear or speak a lot in practice. It's about defining internal roles, responsibilities, who are community liaison officers, what is the right skills and right profile of community liaison officers, and allocating to those specific teams with specific skills rooted really on the ground team, adequate resources is crucial. I've met community liaison officers don't have a car to actually go to communities. We don't have the right training. We don't actually, we're trained on Indigenous people collective rights. So it's about really allocating the right resources, financial, capacity building to answer credibility and rights-based engagement approach on the ground. Then step 3, plan the engagement. And this means having an engagement plan, which needs to be developed in a very participatory, inclusive, context-specific approach, because there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to engagement plan. So it's not a copy-paste. It really should be tailored and built in collaboration with the community itself. Step 4 is about engaging appropriately. So Alancay mentioned a lot when it comes to Indigenous and tribal people. But basically what I wanted to say is that engagement must be adapted to the context, the people, and the project phases. It's definitely not the same to engage during an exploration phase of a project and to engage during a construction, production phase of a project, because impacts are different. So expectation from communities on information sharing, on engagement modalities are different too. That's why we recommend in the guide, again, a risk-based approach. The greater the potential impact is, depending on the phase of the project, the more robust and tailored the engagement should be. The company needs to choose the right method, the right format, the right timing of engagement, adapted to the realities, phases of the project, and adapted also to the people in front. So Alancay mentioned Indigenous and tribal people. Let me emphasize on vulnerable groups, which is definitely not the same. The guide also outlines specific consideration for engaging with vulnerable groups. Women, children, migrants, for instance, which are often excluded or marginalized in the communities. And we included in the guide a practical tool to help companies identify these groups, understand their vulnerability factor, and ensure their inclusion through appropriate intermediaries. And inside Indigenous communities or tribal communities, you will also find vulnerable groups. So there is a double lens when it comes to engagement with Indigenous communities or tribal communities. And back to Alancay points, we also emphasized in the guide how is it important, again, to really understand the specific relationship of indigenous and tribal people with their land, territory, natural resources, because it needs to shape the engagement approach, and also it requires specific respect and consideration for free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, and I'm sure Alancay will expand on that in a few minutes. So we have a Q&A section explaining what FPIC means for company, especially in the context of their responsibility to respect human rights and avoid complicity in violation, particularly in case of state failure to unfold or implement proper consultation under FPIC. And step 5 of the guide is about designing effective grievance mechanism, which is really crucial. It's not a duplication of the mechanism you have indoor for workers. These really need to be adapted to the realities of communities. Same for effective remedy, which is step 6, right? So we have a focus on how to engage communities affected adversely to come to an effective remediation. We quote an indigenous leader saying that the one who suffer the pain are the most adequately placed to actually identify the right remedy, right? So we emphasize that. And finally, the last step is about communication, and it's back to CSRD requirements. So we put together some KPIs for companies to report effectively and meaningfully also on how they engage, how they identify first, and how they engage with affected communities. Thanks, Luís.
Thank you so much, Céline. Now moving on to Alancay, and as Céline spoke about, could you explain more about FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, means in practice? What role should companies play in ensuring FPIC is respected, especially in contexts where states are officially responsible for those consultations? What is expected from businesses in these situations? Thank you.
Yes, Luis. So free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC as we call it, is a cornerstone of indigenous people's rights under international law. FPIC is, let's say, it's codified or developed in instruments such as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as ILO Convention 169. As well as the jurisprudence by UN treaty bodies and regional human rights mechanisms as well. So FPIC affirms that indigenous peoples have to be consulted before any proposed action, and indigenous peoples have the right to give or withhold their consent before any project starts being developed that may affect their lands, their territories, or resources. There are slight differences in the language that we have in the UN Declaration as well as in ILO 1 Convention 169, but there are key elements or the principles that basically free is that this has to be done free from coercion or pressure. Prior is that this has to be done prior to the project that's going to be proposed, and we have seen cases, in multiple cases around the world where there is a decision by a tribunal stating that the consent of indigenous people should have been done before the project was developed, but now the project is in place. And so the damages and everything, the impacts have already been done. So prior holds a very important part there. And lastly, that this should be based on full information. So when the state has basically it's the duty bearer when it comes to the right to FPIC, and basically it means that the state is responsible for ensuring that these consultation processes occur and that the rights are not infringed or violated. So in practice, for companies, this means that they should respect the FPIC and that processes should be done to ensure that indigenous people's decision-making processes take place in the right way. A key tension that lies here is related to, as I mentioned earlier, that there are different countries in Africa, Asia, that do not recognize indigenous peoples, so the right to FPIC in the domestic frameworks is not developed either. So Then what's the role of a company in cases like this? And I think it's important to understand the following. A, that indigenous peoples in this consent processes have the right to withhold consent, the right to grant consent, or grant consent with modifications to whatever is being proposed. And basically what companies need to understand about FPIC is that FPIC is also a safeguard for indigenous peoples. So basically this is to protect the collective rights of indigenous peoples, and that consent is also has to be understood by its true meaning of what consent is. And the foundational rights that give rise to FPIC include the right to self-determination, our right to control lands or territories, and even the prohibition from racial discrimination. The Inter-American Commission recently, in one of its decisions or recommendations, in the context of large-scale mining operations, it stated that this should be preceded by free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples in order to proceed in a legal fashion. So this means in compliance with international human rights standards. This standard is not particular or specific to the Inter-American system. Rather, it applies under international law, and it's binding in a lot of states, given the interpretations that UN treaty bodies have done of the right. And then it underlies that this is a key feature that private sector have human rights responsibilities and that they should respect this right. Another point is that FPIC is not a one-time only type of action. Rather, that consent must be maintained and revisited through the life cycle of a project. So communities may withdraw consent if the terms of the agreement have been violated, if new risks emerge. So there is a fluid nature to consent that underscores this importance of the sustained dialogue and the trust building that Céline and I were mentioning earlier. Lastly is that FPIC is both like a legal requirement and a moral imperative, that it's rooted in these rights that we were mentioning, and it's key for us to that this is respected in business operations to ensure that our future generations can enjoy their territory, their identity as indigenous. Another thing that's happening in terms of standard developing, let's say like in industry associations, for example, is that a lot of emphasis is being placed on the exception. What happens when a community says no? Does this mean that the project should not be done? And there is a lot of things being developed in that sense, even to the point that, for example, in the mining industry, there is the possibility for the companies in the standards that are being developed to continue with projects in spite of indigenous people's opposition. So trust building, making sure that the processes are in place, it's key to ensure that this right is respected in the context of business operations.
Thank you so much, Alancay. I think we could now follow to our final words. I would like to ask Céline and Alancay if you have our final words to our listeners on this topic.
Well, I can go first. We don't have much time. Again, back to what we discussed, I think it's really important to embrace a paradigm shift when it comes to the relationship between businesses and affected communities. And we hope this guide as a practical toolbox will help company at all levels of maturity and also civil society actors, indigenous communities, every actors involved in corporate community engagement to enhance community engagement practices. So, of course, what makes this guide quite unique, it was co-created with both companies and affected communities. So it's drawing on diverse live experience from the ground, including the Q&A on FPIC. Alancay was just mentioning that it's really co-developed by indigenous leaders, NGOs, companies to find a common understanding and a common language. So next step is the implementation of this guide for us. translating principles into practice. So if you are a company committed to do the right thing on the ground, please reach out.
So I want to echo Celine's comment on the importance of the guide and multiple things that are developed, because some of the things that we are mentioning, it's not specifically just on Indigenous peoples, but the threats that we're facing as humanity requires us to work together for these common solutions. Just in the context of the just transition, a lot of the minerals and renewable energy potential is on Indigenous peoples' lands. Indigenous peoples are not opposing the just transition, but we need to have the rights-based approach, and tools like the guide that's being developed, as well as other resources that can be found in this podcast, will help us work together towards solution that lift us all up, instead of affecting, having us on the losing end as historically it has been, and making sure that we have a more just and equitable future. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you today.
Thank you so much, Céline and Alancay. It's a great pleasure to have such great speakers and people that are on the ground working with those topics every day. Thank you so much, and listen to our podcast. Thank you.